Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the National Conference of State Legislatures and the Pew Charitable Trust for this briefing on state legislator demographics. My name is Brian Weberg. I'm the Director of Legislative Studies at the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's webinar, Who Governs? A Look at the Demographics of State Legislators. As a reminder, at any time during this webinar, if you have difficulty hearing the audio through your computer speakers, please use your telephone to dial in to hear the audio portion. Next slide, please. The National Conference of State Legislatures is pleased to partner with the Pew Charitable Trust to bring you this webinar. In case you're not familiar with NCSL, it is a bipartisan organization that serves the state legislators and staffs of the nation's 50 states and its commonwealths and territories. NCSL provides a number of different services, including research, testimony, consulting, and opportunities for lawmakers to exchange ideas on pressing state policy issues. The subject of legislator demographics falls within the jurisdiction of NCSL's Legislative Effectiveness Committee, one of 9 national NCSL committees composed of legislators and legislative staff that provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, as well as a framework for developing the public policy positions for NCSL. These committees meet twice a year at the NCSL Legislative Summit and the NCSL Capitol Forum. For more information on these meetings or NCSL's activities and services to legislators and legislative staff, please visit our website at www.ncsl.org. Next slide, please. The purpose of this webinar is to discuss the new research about the demographics of the nation's 7,383 state legislators. This research has been conducted jointly by NCSL and the Pew Charitable Trust. These new data, when understood in the context of historical trends and compared to the nation's demographic makeup, say a lot about our representative institutions, elections, and politics. Next slide, please. Today's webinar features 2 presentations. The first presentation will highlight the key trends in legislator demographics that emerge from this research. That discussion will be followed by a presentation that goes into more depth on several key aspects of the data. After we hear from our panelists, we will open up the discussion to include questions from the audience. To ask questions, you simply type a question in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner of your screen. Your question won't be visible to everyone, only to the webinar administrators. We will take as many questions as possible within the time we have available. Next slide, please. Our first speaker is Carl Kurtz, president of the consulting firm Legislators and the former director of NCSL's Trust for Representative Democracy. Carl served as the principal investigator and analyst on this study. Carl has written, consulted, lectured widely on American state legislatures, elections, and public opinion. He's the co-author of Republic on Trial, The Case for Representative Democracy, and co-editor of Institutional Change in American Politics, The Case of Term Limits. Carl has provided advice and assistance in the development of democratic institutions to legislators and legislative staff throughout the world. Next slide. Our second presenter is Scott Greenberger. Scott is executive editor of Stateline, the daily news service for the Pew Charitable Trust. Scott guides a team of veteran journalists who report on state politics and policy in the 50 states and the District of Columbia. Before joining Pew, Scott was a staff writer at the Boston Globe, where he covered education, served as City Hall bureau chief, and was the primary policy reporter in the Globe's State House Bureau. He wrote extensively about city and state politics, budgets, healthcare, crime, housing, and economic development. We look forward to hearing from both of our distinguished speakers, and we thank them for agreeing to participate in the session today. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Carl Kurtz. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm reporting to you today on a joint project by NCSL and the Pew Charitable Trust on who serves in our state legislatures and the Congress. It's a study of what political scientists call descriptive representation, the extent to which our elected officials look like the rest of America. We look at 6 demographic characteristics: age, gender, race and ethnicity, education, occupation, and religion. The headline on this story, which first appeared in NCSL's State Legislatures magazine, is "Legislatures are becoming more diverse, but not as diverse as the American public." I'm looking forward to sharing some interesting numbers with you, but before I do, I want to say a few words about how we gathered the data. We started with information compiled as of April 2015 by a directory publishing company, KnowWho. KnowWho obtained their information by electronically scraping public information available on websites. NCSL then supplemented that information by surveying key legislative staff who collect data like this in their own states. We also obtained information from various special interest national caucuses of state legislators. Finally, we looked at thousands of legislative websites to find or verify information that had been missed. Next slide, please. Let's get to the data on women and minority legislators. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be reporting primarily on national data for all 7,400 state legislators and members of Congress. But you can get detailed information for your own state legislature on NCSL's website, www.ncsl.org. This chart shows that there are 6 times as many women legislators today as in 1971. But since 2009, the number of women legislators has leveled off at about 1/4 of all state lawmakers. The number of Black and Hispanic legislators has also risen significantly, but African American representation, like that of women, has leveled off in the last 6 years at about 9%. In the presentation that follows mine, Scott Greenberger will get into some of the whys of these and other data that I describe here. Next slide, please. This slide compares the proportion of women and minorities in state legislators and Congress to the population as a whole. At 24% of all state legislators, women are significantly underrepresented compared to their 51% share of the public. Blacks are close to their 13th slice of the general population, but Latinos, at 5% of legislators, significantly lag behind their 16% proportion of the national population. Next slide. Here you can see the states where women are best represented. The darker the color, the higher the proportion of women legislators. They do best in the West and Northeast, and less well in the South. Looking at partisan differences, which are not shown on this slide, women make up 34% of all Democratic state legislators and 17% of Republicans. Women constitute a majority of the Democratic legislators in the states of Colorado, Idaho, Montana, and Utah. Next slide, please. I think this slide about the geographic distribution of minority legislators is particularly interesting. Minority legislators, primarily Blacks and Hispanics, do best in the states along the southern border and coasts of the United States. Not surprisingly, given party voting patterns, 5% of all Republican state legislators are minorities compared to 1/3 of the Democrats. African Americans make up the majority of Democrats in 9 states in the South. Blacks and Latinos together hold the majority of Democratic seats in the Arizona, California, and Nevada legislatures. Next slide, please. State legislators range in age from 19 to 94. As you can see from this slide, their average is nearly 20 years older than that of the U.S. adult population and slightly younger than members of Congress. New Hampshire has by far the oldest average age of any legislature. That's probably largely due to their status as a legislature that has 424 members, requires at least a 5-month commitment of time, but has total compensation for members of only $100 per year, nothing else. Retirees make up a large portion of the membership of the New Hampshire legislature as a result. The other states among the 5 oldest in the country similarly have relatively low compensation for members. Among the 4 states, leaving out the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, with the lowest average age, the common denominator among 3 of them is that they have limits on the number of terms that members can serve. That stands to reason, as term limits mean there are no long-serving members who, naturally, are older than the rest of the members. Our tests for statistical significance confirm that legislators in the 15 term-limited states are on average 3 years younger than those in the non-term limited states. Interestingly, age is the only statistically significant effective term limits on the demographics of legislators. Contrary to the claims of advocates of term limits, they did not result in more women and more minorities in the term-limited legislatures. Next slide, please. Sticking to the age theme, but switching to generations, you can see here that American adults, those are the gray bars here, are about equally distributed among the millennials, the Gen Xers, and the baby boomers. But in legislatures and the Congress, the boomers predominate. Millennials are substantially underrepresented, but their numbers are growing as they age. They're about 5% of all legislators today, but they were only 1% 6 years ago in 2009. Next slide, please. America's legislators are much better educated than the general public. Nearly 70% of the population have less than a college degree, whereas very few legislators did not graduate from college. A caveat here, though. We were unable to find data on age for nearly a quarter of the state legislators. Assuming that legislators would be less likely to self-report on their websites that they have only a high school or community college education, the number of legislators in this category is probably somewhat undercounted. The difference between Congress and state legislatures on the proportion of members with graduate or professional degrees, the rightmost set of bars, is largely accounted for by law degrees. More than twice as many federal lawmakers have law degrees, 39% of them, as compared to state legislators, 17%. Looking at partisan differences, Democrats and Republicans are about the same on bachelor's and advanced degrees combined, but Democrats have a higher proportion with graduate or professional degrees. Next slide, please. Turning to religion, Christians make up 56% of all state legislators. But in many ways, the most interesting slice of this pie chart is the 42% who don't disclose a religious preference at all. We don't know whether this is for privacy reasons or it is a statement that they have no religious affiliation or that it is not important in their lives. The non-Christian segment on this slide is primarily Jewish legislators. Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists combined make up less than 1% of the total. Only one state legislator in the country reports himself as an atheist. Next slide, please. Comparing the religions of lawmakers to the general public, the profiles are remarkably similar. Next slide, please. Business is the single largest category of occupations for state legislators, with many of them business owners. This slide shows only occupations that have a 5% or greater share of the total and sums to 84%, meaning that 16% are in other occupations not listed here. And I think it's a demonstration of the diversity of people in our legislatures. Next slide. NCSL has been collecting occupational data for legislators since 1979. While there are problems of consistency of coding of occupations over time and across occupational categories by different researchers, the trends over time are interesting. In 3 of these selected occupations shown here, business, law, and agriculture, there has been a secular decline. Within these national data, there are some dramatic individual state data. For example, in North Dakota, the percentage of farmers and ranchers has declined by 26 points since 1979. There is a 30% decline in the number of businessmen in the Alaska legislature during the same period. And attorneys in the Virginia General Assembly have declined 17 points. Those who report their occupations as legislators were up until 2009, but are down in the most recent accounting. This category of legislator illustrates the problem of relying on self-reporting by legislators. In some states, it seems acceptable to claim that one's job is being a legislator. For example, in Pennsylvania, one of the most full-time legislatures, about half of the members say that legislator is their occupation. In neighboring Delaware, which is a substantially less full-time legislature, still nearly 1/3 of the members say that their job is being a legislator. But out in California, arguably the most full-time legislature outside of Congress, only 8% of the members say that their occupation is legislator. Next slide, please. As we would expect, more Republicans are in business or in agriculture, and Democrats are more numerous among the consultant and nonprofit professions and education. Attorneys are about even between the two parties. Next slide, please. To wrap up here, I started out by saying that we have studied descriptive representation, the extent to which different demographic categories of American legislators are represented in our elected legislatures. Most of us would probably say that it would be a good thing for our legislatures to better reflect the proportions of women and minorities in our population. On the other hand, I doubt that most of us would argue that the membership of our legislatures should match the 70% of Americans who have only a high school education. We want our elected officials to be better educated. Moreover, looking like America is not the only quality of representation that matters. A more important test of good legislators is the extent to which they listen and pay attention to the opinions and interests of their constituents. Not necessarily always agreeing with them, but doing their best to respond to their needs in some fashion. In other words, representation is in the doing, not the belonging. Thanks very much for joining us today and listening to me. I'll be glad to respond to questions after Scott Greenberger from the Pew Charitable Trusts provides his presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Carl. I represent, I work for the Pew Charitable Trust, but my specific title here is Executive Editor of Stateline, and Stateline is a journalism project of the Trust. And what we did with this very interesting data was to write initially 3 stories, and then we added a 4th story, taking a closer look at each of these categories, or at some of the main categories, and asking the question, as reporters often do, why? Carl's done a great job of summarizing some of the top-line findings, so I'd like to talk a little bit about the answers to that why question, or at least what people told us in our reporting. So on the first slide here, you can see, and Carl mentioned this, that a quarter of the nation's state legislators are women, which is in fact up dramatically from the 5% figure of the early 1970s. However, and you can see that on the far left of this slide, but you can also see towards the right that things have plateaued over the past decade or more. And the question is, why is that? And what we found was that it really is not so much an issue of gender discrimination at the ballot box as much as it is an issue of encouraging more women to run. So the first reason that we don't have more women running is simply that party leaders in all the states are less likely to recruit female candidates, and also that women are less likely than men to run without being asked. Many women will agree to run after being recruited, but that requires parties and state legislators to reach out to them. Most party leaders and legislators are white men, and when they look for recruits, they turn first to people like them. Another challenge is that it takes more time to convince female recruits to take the plunge, which means recruiters have to be determined and patient. One state legislator we spoke to in Washington State told us that when women first think about running, up until the time that they actually run is about 3 years, but for men it's about 3 weeks. A woman we spoke to from the National Women's Political Caucus of Washington noted that women don't just wake up one day and look at themselves in the mirror the way men, quite frankly, do and say, I should run for office. It's a more difficult and protracted decision for them. Also, in addition to that, many younger women worry about balancing a political career with family obligations. Of course, there is more gender equity than there once was in terms of household duties, but still, for the most part, women are doing the lion's share of that work, and they are reluctant, if they have younger children, to add politics to what might already be another profession and their family obligations. Another thing that is important to note is that more women are in fact registered as Democrats, so that has something to do with the disparity between the parties that Carl mentioned. But also the GOP has been less active in recruiting female candidates in terms of providing trainings and PACs and support targeted to women. And of course, because Republicans have been less successful in recruiting female candidates, their recent dominance at the state level has contributed to the stalled progress we saw in that previous slide. So the question is then, and Carl began to talk about this, but why does it matter if our legislatures aren't evenly split between men and women? And what we found, or what people told us, is that while it might not take a woman to speak up on issues that are important to women, state legislators and researchers who have studied the issue say, regardless of party, women often bring a different working style and more varied life perspectives to the legislative arena, in addition to a stronger focus on women, children, and family issues. Political observers, for example, have credited women with helping to end the 2013 federal government shutdown, generally describing women as better at setting aside egos to get work done. I think it's interesting that out of the 14 senators who served on the bipartisan committee that laid the framework for the debt deal, 6 were women. Senator Susan Collins of Maine told the New York Times, I don't think it's a coincidence that women were so heavily involved in trying to end the stalemate. Although we span the ideological spectrum, we are used to working together in a collaborative way. I mentioned earlier that younger women with young children at home can be reluctant to run. And of course, that also has an impact politically, because in most places it takes time to rise through the political ranks. So delaying a run until their children are older can be costly. And because they don't have as much time to earn the seniority that delivers real power and often the chance to run for higher office, that's another factor in, or another barrier for them in reaching some sort of parity with men in state legislatures. So moving on to racial and ethnic diversity. The map on your screen shows the range and the percentage of minority state legislators across the country. Dark purple means more minority legislators served, and light purple means fewer. Between 1971 and 2009, the percentage of African American state legislators more than quadrupled, from 2 to 9%. But much of that growth came during the early years in that period. The share of African American state legislators has increased by only a single percentage point since 1999. So again, the question is why the disparity? Why the disparity between the demographics of legislatures and the demographics of the country as a whole? First of all, research shows that in local elections, voters tend to vote for candidates who look like them. That's a problem when a large proportion of minority voters are lumped together in a handful of districts, which is often the case. Such clustering increases the chances of there being at least a few minority legislators, but makes it less likely there will be very many of them. Another factor that depresses minority strength in state legislatures is economics. Few first and second generation immigrants can afford to get by on a part-time legislator's salary, or have the kind of careers that will afford them the flexibility to serve in office. The same is true for many native-born blacks and Latinos. Black, Latino, and other minority candidates also often lack political connections. And finally, the lack of minority representation is self-perpetuating because it's harder for people to imagine running for the legislature if there aren't lawmakers who are already there who look like them. Republican dominance at the state level hasn't helped here because minority lawmakers are much more likely to be Democrats. 33% of Democratic state legislators are minorities compared to only 5% of Republican state legislators. Much of the progress at the state level in terms of increasing diversity can be traced to the rapid growth of the Latino electorate or court-ordered mandates to accommodate minority districts rather than efforts to recruit candidates from racial or ethnic minorities or white voters' willingness to elect minorities. A woman who studies this from Duke University told us that while blacks are still elected from districts that are predominantly black, until there's a time that blacks can run and win in districts that are not majority minority, you won't see significant increases in their representation. Another reason that we see on this map, and Carl referred to this as well, that the African American representation is higher in the South, is the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. Under that provision, states with a history of racial discrimination needed to get permission from the federal government to enact any changes to their voting laws. As of 2013, 9 states, mostly in the South, were subject to the law. But the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the provision in June of that year, and it's unclear what effect the change will have on minority representation in those states. Again, the question is, does it matter? Over the decades, research has shown the relative lack of minority representation in state houses has an impact on the legislation that is debated and approved. A woman who studies this at the University of Iowa told us, if you have more minorities in state government, you get policies that are a little more favorable toward minorities. Legislatures with fewer minority lawmakers make policies that are less responsive to minorities and can lower their political engagement. Next slide. So on education and occupation, the share of lawmakers who work in agriculture, which is the blue line on this slide, is half of what it was in 1976. Since then, the percentage of farmers has fallen from 9.7 to 4.6%. Even traditional agricultural states have seen the percentage of legislators who consider themselves farmers fall off. North Dakota, which had the greatest percentage of farmers at 42% in 1986, experienced the largest drop in the 29 years. Now 16%, or 23 of 141 legislators, are farmers. Despite the decline in the number of farmer legislators, states that count agriculture as their leading industry still have more legislators who work in farming, ranching, or food processing than other states. In Nebraska, for instance, 22% claim agriculture as their occupation. South Dakota claims 17%, North Dakota 16%, Iowa 14%, and Idaho 13%. But farmers aren't the only ones holding fewer seats than they used to. The percentage of lawyers, shown in the orange line, serving in state houses dropped from 22.3% in 1976 to 14.4% this year. Lawmakers with business backgrounds, the green line, hold the biggest share of seats. The survey found 29.5% of legislators are business owners or are in accounting, insurance, real estate, or other business fields. In all, 55% of state legislators nationwide work in business, are lawyers, or say lawmaking is their main profession. In 1976, 61% of legislators were in those fields. The survey also revealed that legislators generally have higher educational attainment than the population as a whole, or the populations in the states they serve. Full-time legislators, who tend to be serving in more populous states, generally are more likely to have college diplomas than those in states with part-time legislatures. On this map, the darker red shows states with a higher percentage of legislators that have bachelor's or advanced degrees. Lighter red shows states with a lower percentage. Legislators are most likely to have diplomas in Texas, Nebraska, California, New York, and Ohio. As an example, you can see the breakdown for New York on this slide. In those states, between 85 and 93% of lawmakers have a bachelor's degree or higher. Legislators are least likely to have a bachelor's degree or higher in Maine and New Hampshire, where less than half of lawmakers have a diploma. New Hampshire's details are now shown on the screen. So why the change over this period of time? As the U.S. shifted from mechanized agriculture, people moved off farms into urban areas. Then in the 60s and 70s, the U.S. Supreme Court mandated that all state legislative and U.S. congressional districts be redrawn and that equal populations be represented in each district. That meant fewer districts in rural areas. Again, does it matter what legislators do outside of the legislature? Legislators do say that their occupation influences their policymaking more than their education. And what they do for a living ranges greatly by how much they are paid in the legislature, when they are in session, and the main industries in their state. Just how much a legislator's educational background affects policymaking is unclear. At the least, a higher education may help lawmakers understand the complicated legislative process. But on the other hand, legislatures were never set up so that representatives had to be experts or even highly educated. As one professor at the University of Illinois told us, we don't have a system of philosopher kings. It's a democracy. We select people who represent the voters. Not all the people are geniuses, and not all the legislators are geniuses. So that concludes my presentation, and I look forward to questions, but also all of these maps in an interactive format are available on our website, which is stateline.org, and you can find all of the stories we wrote on the various aspects of this very interesting research there. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Carl. We've heard from our presenters now, and it's time to take questions. So again, I will encourage you to type your questions in the Q&A box on the right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll take as many of those as we can in the time available. And as we're waiting for the questions to come in, I want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and it will be archived on the NCSL website. Let me start out with a question to Carl, sort of a general one, Carl. And I noticed when I looked through the list of people who are signing up for this webinar today that there's a great number of government affairs professionals in the audience. And what does all this mean if you're in that business? What should our government affairs folks take from this in the big picture?
Well, I think that's a good question. I guess what I think of is that all of these data demonstrate the huge diversity of our legislatures. And while I presented national data here, Scott and I both mentioned some cases of individual states that are particularly interesting. And I think that public affairs professionals who are dealing across the states need to pay attention to that diversity of our legislatures and act accordingly.
Well, thanks, Carl. We have a question that has come in about the location of the slides from this website, and we're going to get back to you on that in just a moment. Before we conclude this, we'll direct you to those slides and their availability. Scott, I wanted to turn to you, if I can, with a question about women in politics. The data are pretty stunning in that respect in terms of underrepresentation. They have been for a long time, and there's this plateau now. And you've gone into some of the reasons about why that is, but I wonder if you were able to discover anything about the differences between the states and the level of women who are elected to office from state to state, because it varies quite dramatically.
Yeah, it sure does. I thought that was one of the more interesting findings. And more specifically, the Northeast and the West have had more success in getting women to serve as lawmakers than other regions. And some of the reasons that we heard for that, or possible reasons, are when it comes to the Northeast, it has more citizen legislatures where legislators represent fewer people, and the role isn't viewed as a profession, so people tend to cycle in and out more. which creates more opportunities and reduces the power of incumbency. And then in the West, the relatively high percentage of female lawmakers may, and this is interesting, may have its origins in a settler's culture in which women and men often worked side by side. Western states, it's interesting to note, also were among the first to grant voting rights to women. And then on the flip side, in the South, which tends to be more conservative and where traditional gender roles hold greater sway, they tend to have the lowest percentages of women. So there are some interesting regional differences there.
Thanks, Scott. Carl, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I've actually made a note to myself. Scott talked about male leaders recruiting male candidates. I haven't looked systematically at whether states where there have been women in top leadership positions have higher proportions of women, and maybe women leaders more actively recruit women legislators. So sometime in the future I'll get to that, and I'll write a blog post or something about it.
All right. We have a question that I'll pose to both of you, and it's a good one about redistricting. And what effect do you think the way district maps have been drawn, what influence does our redistricting process have on these demographic results, especially the number of women and minorities in the legislatures? That's not an easy question to answer, but I'll toss it to Carl. I'll start with you, and then Scott, if you want to add on.
Well, Scott already talked about the Voting Rights Act and the requirement for the Justice Department to review the redistricting plans in the South, which has had an impact on increasing the representation of minorities. Beyond that, there is a tendency, especially the Democrats and the Republicans tend to differ on this, depending on their control of the legislature. In Republican-controlled legislatures, there's a tendency to pack Democratic voters into Democratic districts and therefore increase the number of Republican voting districts. The Democrats do the reverse, and since the Democrats have more minority supporters than Republicans, that partisan control has an impact. As far as the impact of redistricting on women, I'm not sure I think of anything in particular.
Anything else to add there, Scott, before we move on?
Well, yeah, I would agree with Carl that when it comes to women, I don't think that redistricting or the way the lines are drawn has much of an impact, but certainly it has a lot to do with racial and ethnic representation. As Carl noted, I mean, it's a perennial issue and fight between the parties and in the states. I mean, I think right now there are at least half a dozen court cases going on regarding the way the lines are drawn, and because it is the case at this point in our history that minority voters tend to vote Democratic in a state that is controlled by Republicans, they have an interest in packing them into a relatively small number of districts, which, as I noted, ensures that there will be at least some minority representation, but does put a cap on the overall number, at least as long as we are voting along racial lines, which we tend to do still, unfortunately. I mean, people do, as I noted, tend to vote for people who look like them. So as long as these dynamics continue, redistricting and the way the lines are drawn will have a real impact on this.
And Scott, I want to follow up a previous question about women in politics, sort of close the loop on that one. And one of the interesting pieces of the data here is that 60% of the women who are serving in state legislatures are Democrat, of the Democratic Party, and 40% Republican. Do you have any insights into that difference and how that comes about?
Well, I mean, there is a gender gap between the parties, but in terms of the political orientation of women and men, and you see that in presidential elections. But it is also a question of doing the sorts of things that will get more female candidates to run, and for whatever reason, perhaps because it's considered to be, or there are more people to choose from on the Democratic side, they've been much more active in trying to recruit female candidates. And as I noted, for whatever reason, and this of course is a general statement, and individuals are different, but that generally speaking, it is more difficult to get women to take the plunge. And so you need to, if you want more female representation in your party, you really have to work hard to recruit female candidates.
Carl?
I would add to that this is a reflection of voting patterns more generally, that more women identify with the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So it's not surprising that we have more women legislators among the Democrats.
Well, we've got more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. And I would add that at the end of the presentation, you'll see a slide that will give you some information about how to get to this information on the web. So for those of you that are looking for that, just stand by for a minute, and we'll have that available for you. And I'm going to direct the last two questions to Carl and Scott. I hope that you will add in as we move along in this as well. Another interesting piece of the data regards millennials and the millennial generation and their vast underrepresentation and the overrepresentation of baby boomers like me. Millennials are known for being more civically engaged, maybe than the generation.
Well, I think a couple of things. So one of them is probably simple economics. In the great majority of state legislatures, you can't make a living just being a state legislator. You have to have another source of income. So young people who are just getting established economically would have more difficulty doing the semi-volunteer work that serving in a legislature is. Secondly, while they might be more engaged politically, the people who tend to get elected are the ones who have established community ties, and it takes time to build those up. And often those who serve in state legislatures have previously served in local government offices. So to the extent that there is that ladder or stepping stone, it takes a while. So another reason why the younger generations are less well represented.
Scott, anything before I move to our last question?
Yeah, I would agree with Carl. I think the main factor there is you do have to be at a certain point in life for this to make sense for you. But I think it's also interesting to note that this millennial generation, the connection between this topic and some of the earlier topics is that the millennials also are more racially diverse than older generations. So if in fact they do end up as they advance in life being represented in much larger numbers, as we would expect, then that would have an impact on racial diversity as well. And also it's interesting to note that they are, across the parties, they tend to be much more socially liberal. For example, 69% of millennials favor legalizing marijuana, while only 52% of the baby boomers do. So it'll be interesting to see as their numbers increase how that'll change the climate in legislatures.
Thanks, Scott. And finally, let's turn back to the occupations data, because that's always an interesting one. And you both have talked a little bit about the impacts of redistricting and the one person, one vote, and how that changed things back through the end of the last century and started to and rural-urban shift, if you will. But there are lots of other interesting changes in the occupations data. Carl, do you have any reflections on some of those changes that we see out there?
Yeah, just a couple of things. The attorneys, the decline in attorneys, I think there a couple of reasons for that. One is that over time, the time demands of legislative work have increased. It's a more demanding job than it used to be. Legislative districts are bigger than they used to be. Legislatures spend more time in session. The federal government is relying more on the states to do things. So the job has expanded. And so those who have particularly demanding jobs outside the legislature, like lawyers, are maybe less likely to run than they used to be. Another possible factor for lawyers is the increase in financial disclosure requirements. In some states, they not only require financial disclosure of the sources of income of lawyers, they may require the sources of income of their law firms. And that is can cause lawyers to choose not to run for the legislature. Among the people who say that they are legislators, we noted that there was a decline since the last time we measured it in 2009. I think that has to do with just a general public distrust of politicians. And so if you're self-reporting your profession, you're less likely to say, well, my profession is politician or legislator. So I think it's kind of a public pressure thing.
And Scott, would you like to have the last word before we wrap things up?
Well, sure. I agree with a lot of what Carl said. It'd be interesting to dig a little deeper into some of this data, because there are, in fact, there are some states where the percentage of lawyers remains pretty high. We found, for example, that in 7 states, New Jersey, Louisiana, Virginia, South Carolina, Texas, Florida, and Mississippi, the percentage is still at 25% or higher. In New Jersey, it's 30%. So it'd be interesting to take a closer look and see whether some of the potential reasons that Carl mentioned are apply in some of the taking a look at the differences between states.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Carl. That brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. If we could move to the next slide. If you have any questions following this event, I welcome you to contact me directly at NCSL, and there is my email address on the screen. You also see the link that many of you requested to where this information is available on our website. Let's go to the next slide, where I will remind you that the full text of any report highlighted today, along with additional resources, is available through both the NCSL and Pew websites. Next slide. Lastly, and very important to us, is we ask you to take a moment to share your feedback about this webinar by taking a short survey at the link listed on the screen. Thank you very much for your interest today and for your participation in this webinar.